Welcome back to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I am Matthew.
And I'm Christian, the CEO of Artorias, and we are with All Source News tonight.
Hello, thank you very much for having me. I'm also News. I'm an account on X, formerly known as Twitter, that focuses on Mexican cartels. Thank you very much for having me.
So, All Source, my understanding, obviously, is that you focus a lot on Central America and specifically the cartels in Mexico. One of the big stories that we keep seeing pop up is this civil war that seems to be brewing or underway with the Sinaloa cartel. Obviously it's something that you're tracking, but could you give us a little bit of background information on that?
Absolutely. So the immediate effect of the Sinaloa cartel civil war is basically two of the main factions that formed the Sinaloa cartel are actively fighting right now. And so if you look at the Sinaloa cartel, you have to analyze that it was formed and created by El Chapo. We kind of all know the name, very common name that we all associate with Mexican cartels. El Chapo was detained and then extradited to the United States. And so the Sinaloa cartel then had kind of like two main factions that coexisted, but there was also tensions and then sometimes fighting, but they were a coexistence. The two main factions were the Mayo Zambada faction, who was the right-hand man of El Chapo, and then El Chapo's son, formed Los Chapitos, names of El Chapo's sons that are kind of famous were Ivan Archibaldo, Jesus, Ovidio Guzman, and then his son also named Joaquin Guzman were kind of the sons of El Chapo, and they formed Los Chapitos, right? So those were kind of the two factions. What happened was Mayo Zambada, and probably an operation that defies even what you would see in Hollywood. Mayo Zambada was detained actually in El Paso, Texas. And so how was he detained? Well, the United States had one of the sons of El Chapo, probably one of the lowest leader within the architecture of Los Chapitos, because there's four brothers, and he was kind of like the least influential. Basically was an FBI informant. The FBI managed to turn him. And the son managed to convince Mayo Zambada to get on a plane with him and tricked him into saying, hey, we're going to go see some property near the U.S.-Mexican border, right, in Mexico. So Mayo Zambada was tricked. And long story short, that plane, instead of, Mayo Zambada was put in a plane, and while they were flying, it actually flew straight into right next to El Paso, Texas, where, U.S. law enforcement detained him. And I think the gravity of what people don't understand is Mayo Zambada was the cartel figure. I mean, this guy was untouchable. He's been doing drug trafficking for over 40 years. Undisputably, he was his faction of the Sinaloa cartel was probably the most powerful cartel in all of Mexico. Much more, I think he was more powerful than Los Chapitos, more powerful than, Jalisco New Generacion, the Jalisco New Generation cartel. I mean, Mayo Zambada was this powerful figure who controlled international drug trafficking. So when Mayo Zambada was detained and that was released, and it was known that one of the sons of El Chapo basically was the one who turned him in, the Mayo Zambada faction was livid. They were furious because of this betrayal. And the son of Mayo Zambada, Mayito Flaco, or MF, kind of took over the Mayo Zambada organization. And for about months, we started to see slowly but surely tensions start to rise, tensions start to rise, tensions start to rise. We started to see rhetoric from the side of the, Mayito Flaco, kind of openly declaring their hostility to Los Chapitos. And one of the things, though, is that Mayo Zambada was really well known for was he was the guy who kind of strived for peace, specifically within the Sinaloa cartel. He was kind of more this old school drug cartel leader, right? That was more focused on trafficking, making money, maintaining peace and calm. It's kind of ironic when you're looking at the cartel leaders, right? Los Chapitos were more the new kids in the block trying to make their name in a way, kind of this almost like this cowboy-esque a Wild West mentality. And Mayo Zambada was more of this trying to always maintain the peace, because anytime there was previously tensions within the Sinaloa cartel, Mayo Zambada was kind of like this guy trying to maintain the calm and peace. And this is from multiple reporting and sources that I have. And, Mayo Zambada wasn't this violent in the sense territorially centric, trying to declare war on everybody and control everything. That wasn't necessarily his style, because he basically reached the power top of all cartels, and he acknowledged and recognized that. And again, when I say that he was untouchable, like there was never really an operation that detained him or even attempted to detain him. There was really no effort or really any time where he was almost being, at the risk of getting captured by U.S. or Mexican authorities, right? And there's a lot of suspicions that, and almost more than probably suspicion, that Mayo Zambada, had wide range influence within the Mexican government, and everybody just let him alone. Once he was detained and his son came into power, Mayito Flaco, and I will say that shortly after the arrest of Mayo Zambada, kind of the cartel of the Mayo Zambada, because cartels are formed by a lot of groups and factions, subgroups and subfactions, quickly coalesced around Mayito Flaco. And Mayito Flaco basically wanted to avenge his father. He viewed Los Chapitos' action as an ultimate betrayal and basically started the Civil War. And the Civil War really is concentrated in a few areas, right? Sinaloa and Southwest Sonora, right? Sinaloa is in the Pacific coast. It does not border the United States. The state of Sinaloa obviously has always been a heartland of the Sinaloa cartel. And the capital, Culiacan, has always been a stronghold of Los Chapitos specifically. And so what Mayito Flaco did was he started to get all the subgroups of the Mayo Zambada, now Mayito Flaco organization, of his faction, and launched an offensive in Sinaloa specifically. They launched a significant attack against Culiacan, which looked like it wasn't successful. It hasn't been successful, though the Chapitos managed to hold, and they kind of shifted strategy, the Mayito Flaco. And so then what we're starting to see is those Mayito Flacos are trying to advance mostly from southern and maybe, from southern Sinaloa, and even in some areas in the northeast that are closer to Durango and even in Sonora, trying to push in and try to kind of slowly take territory away from Los Chapitos. And so what we're seeing in Sinaloa is, in the beginning of the Civil War, we saw intense clashes occurring in Culiacan. We saw up-armored vehicles, gunmen kind of storm Culiacan. When they weren't able to completely seize control of Culiacan, now we've seen a shift of strategy where now Mayito Flaco is prioritizing seizing territory along southern Sinaloa and slowly start moving up, specifically in other areas around Culiacan. And then in Culiacan proper, because although the Mayito Flacos weren't able to completely seize control, they still have operatives and people that operate in that city, obviously, even before this. And what we're seeing is this kind of this heightened level of assassinations, right? The dumping of bodies, decapitations, leaving dismembered body parts across the city, and this significant increase of assassinations in Culiacan. And although the fighting is mostly centered in Sinaloa, for all intents and purposes, the Sinaloa cartel as a unitary faction that might have existed prior to Mayo Zambada is gone, right? It's now two very different factions, Los Chapitos and now Los Mayito Flaco. And they're all trying to kind of vibe for control for Sinaloa. Again, those Chapitos have been very successful in maintaining, their control, at least of Culiacan for the most part. But the Mayito Flaco organization has been encroaching on territory, and if anything, they have expanded some of the areas where they're operating and doing offensive in other states across Mexico. And it looks like Mayito Flaco is not following his father's footstep, and is really pushing heavily all his groups across multiple regions into offensives against rival cartels. Not only the Chapitos, but CJNG, the Jalisco New Generation cartel, for example, is another area where we see a lot of fighting, both in Nayarit, Zacatecas, and Chiapas, just to name a few. But what is interesting, though, is if you analyze the Sinaloa cartel, this major split within the Sinaloa cartel is probably the big one. There was a smaller split that happened around 2023, specifically within Los Chapitos. So again, as I mentioned, if you have to analyze cartels as groups, factions, and then those factions have subgroups. And so within Los Chapitos in Sonora, we saw some subgroups earlier split off away from Los Chapitos, right? We had Los Salazars is one of the groups, and Los Cazadores, Fantasma Cazadores, they kind of broke off. And so Los Chapitos were already kind of in this weakened position already before this major civil war started to occur. And it's kind of changing the dynamics of Mexican cartel, right? What we're actually now starting to see because of the Civil War is Los Chapitos, there's a lot of chatter and reporting, and I've talked to sources that actually tend to lend belief to this, is that Los Chapitos are either have an agreement or a straight up alliance with would have been their arch enemy before the capture of Mazambada was the CJNG. So we're starting to see Los Chapitos and CJNG almost have an alliance. They definitely have an agreement, at least a non-aggression pact or a ceasefire. But a lot of the reporting we're getting is there's an actual alliance where Los Chapitos and CJNG are now actively fighting Maito Flaco. And so this Sinaloa cartel civil war is not only kind of changing the dynamic and increasing violence in Sinaloa and kind of challenging the what we would consider the Sinaloa cartel's power, but it's rearranging the power dynamics of Mexican cartels in Mexico.
So basically, what you're saying is it's a very complex situation. Alliances are fluid. There are a lot of different points that I think are worth looking into there. And we can lay those out later. But for now, just with the most recent news, I know, or at least I'm pretty sure there was recently a member of the CJ or CJNG who was captured in California. Um, and we're seeing this evolve very quickly. We have this transition in the United States. Overall, what does this mean for the security in Mexico?
Yeah, so that's kind of funny. Yeah, I think it's interesting. All these you always get these reports of major arrests, and I think one of the interesting aspects of now that we're in a transition period between the Biden administration and kind of the Trump presidency is I think what a lot of people don't realize is that the Biden administration and specifically Merrick Garland as the Attorney General have been very successful at capturing senior leaders, senior cartel figures in Mexico. I mean, I think Merrick Garland should be considered probably one of the top tier counter cartel attorney generals in American history. If you really analyze it, I mean, he has captured significant figures in Mexico. He captured under the Biden administration, they captured Rafael Caro Quintero, who was the head of the Caborca cartel. And he used to be one of the originals when this was the Guadalajara cartel, that kind of was the one cartel that kind of dominated Mexico. He was a key figure there, responsible for the death of the DEA agent Kiki Camarena. He was captured under Merrick Garland. Other important figures was Ovidio Guzman, who was one of the sons of El Chapo, who was one of the leaders of Los Chapitos after El Chapo was detained. They managed to turn one of El Chapo's son into an FBI informant, right? That's huge. They captured El Nini. El Nini was the head of security for Los Chapitos, a major figure within Los Chapitos. That his arrest and detainment kind of significantly weakened Los Chapitos. And then more importantly, as mentioned, Maya Zambada. I mean, Maya Zambada, again, it's like what they did is literally comparable. And if you're analyzing this from a counterterrorism point of view, like the death of Osama bin Laden and the operation and how they did it is equally as significant and daring. And so the Biden administration has been very keen on targeting key leaders, specifically the Sinaloa cartel, because the Sinaloa cartel has had a significant role in pushing fentanyl into the United States. And so what we've seen currently in the last year and now with the new Mexican administration, the new president after Andrés Manuel López Obrador, what we're actually seeing security-wise in Mexico is a significant degradation of security, right? Violence is spreading and now in multiple areas in Mexico. And it's not only, I think what people might imagine is just an increase in homicide. It's not only limited to that. What we're actually seeing is cartels battling each other and using tactics that you would see, let's say, in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, right? I mean, it's literally kind of like direct action combat. It's not just assassination, which has already been a problem and increasingly more of a problem in the elevated levels of homicide. But cartels actively fighting for territorial control, utilizing military tactics to achieve their gains. And I mean, I can go through a number of states where violence has increased. I mean, you look at just and if you just analyze it from that purview of military offensives, utilizing up armored vehicles, drones, infantry, And you see these cartels battling it out like Syria. You can look at Sonora, you can look at Tamaulipas, you can look at Sinaloa, Zacatecas, Durango, Chiapas, sometimes even Tabasco, Guerrero. It's spreaded. And what we're seeing is cartels are becoming more and more militarized and more territorial control focus, right? And you can keep on going. I mean, and if we analyze it just from a homicide point of view, right? I mean, Acapulco, which used to be a huge tourist town that Americans used to go, in the 90s and the early 2000s, they would flock Acapulco, which probably nowadays would be Cancun. Acapulco, unfortunately, now is an extremely high homicide rated city, right? You can look at Guanajuato. And so the problem what we're seeing in Mexico is that homicides are not only increasing, but the militarization of this conflict is also increasing. And a lot of that is happening with the cartels in themselves. And a lot of these battles are cartels versus cartels. I mean, Chiapas is a perfect example down at the south that borders Guatemala. I mean, there are daily battles between the Mayito Flaco organization and CG&G, one of the front groups that they have allied to CG&G called the Cartel de Chiapas y Guatemala, are battling each other consistently in scenes, again, reminiscent of the Syrian civil war. And I think that's the problem when we're analyzing Mexico and we talk about cartels. We kind of imagine the scenario of like mafia bosses and kind of like New York City, let's say if we want to compare it to America, or Chicago or Atlanta, where it's kind of like this gang violence, and you kind of see that with just increased levels of homicides, which is definitely happening in Mexico. But people kind of don't associate that necessarily with images more akin to the Sahel or the Middle East, where these active battles. And what we're seeing is that the Mexican government is incapable of having not only just the monopoly of violence, but just kind of maintaining basic level of securities in large swaths of Mexico. And now in the situation in Sinaloa with the Sinaloa Cartel War, it's just spreading and spreading and spreading. And I think that's a huge problem that a lot of people that are not kind of like in tune into the Mexican cartels, just completely gloss over. And that's a huge problem that Mexico is encountering right now.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you talk about the monopoly of violence, which is sort of what the geopolitical wonks use as this sliding scale of failed state versus a healthy functioning state. So I do wonder if you're seeing in certain regions in Mexico areas that the Mexican government does not control. It's very difficult at that point for them not to securitize the situation. And I think that obviously has to be done if they're going to take back some of this land from the cartels. But I also wonder if there's not a more comprehensive strategy, and maybe we focus so much, especially because the cartels kind of focus or kind of force us to focus on the security landscape and that aspect of it. But there's so many different things at play here. One of the things would be employment. Like, why are people going to the cartels? The cartels are one of the largest employers in the country of Mexico. So there's obviously a reason that people are seeking that employment, trying to build a better life. We have also things to consider, like the demand in the United States. That's obviously a very large driving factor here. And then we also have these international institutions that are playing ball with them, whether that's the shipping industry with corrupt officials who are getting drugs into places like Africa, Europe, as far afield as Australia. And then we just have to kind of like take all of this as a whole, because you have banks laundering the money, you have these shipping companies shipping it abroad. We have this demand for it in Europe, in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, pretty much across the globe. And now we have these international criminal organizations who all want their piece of the pie. So is the answer a war with the cartels, or, what are the nuances of that, how we may be able to build a more comprehensive strategy? And I know that's a lot, so we could take a piecemeal, but
No, I mean that's no, because that's very important. I mean, it just highlights the complicated nature of kind of the of cartels. So what I would say, I think the last estimate that was publicly available, and this was a couple of years ago, there was the Washington Post, wrote this article, and kind of down in the article, and this again was a couple of years ago, there was a U.S. intelligence assessment that they stated claimed that about 30% of the Mexican territory was wholeheartedly controlled by cartels. I would probably assume that number has gone up, and that doesn't even include estimates of Mexican cartels having a significant presence in an area cohabitated with Mexican local officials and police and National Guard and military, because you highlight the corruption. And corruption is probably one of the main drivers of why there's cartel control. But because you lay a lot, so let me hit a couple things. One, because a lot of people, when we talk about cartels, inherently everybody thinks about two things, right? And kind of the profits for cartels, and they talk about drugs and now kind of like human trafficking, right? And the migration push along the U.S. Mexican border. And there's this idea that, well, if you focus on that aspect of the revenue, the cartel's power would be weakened, because you're right. I mean, the last estimate that was published is that the cartels are about the fifth largest employer in Mexico. Here's the problem. The cartels don't only traffic drugs or migrants. They are in anywhere where they can make money, they will be involved with. They traffic avocado. They traffic lime. They traffic water. They're in fishing, extortion, you name it. They don't, where they can make money, they will be involved, right? So for example, in Michoacan, avocado and lime is one of the main resources that we have cartels fighting for. And Zacatecas is also a state where we see kind of what I mentioned earlier of this kind of like intense, Syria-like civil war battles are occurring in Zacatecas. And a lot of these battles are actually occurring in very remote areas, not in the cities or towns, in the mountain regions. So there's various groups that operate. Kind of the two main ones when you're looking at Zacatecas is the organization called Carteles Unidos, and then the one that we're very familiar with is CGNG, Jalisco New Generation. And a lot of the resources they fight for are actually tied to agriculture, right? And so you can try to analyze this from a drug consumption point of view, but the cartels are going to go where they're going to make money. And if that means trafficking oil, they will do that. And so that's kind of the issue, right? And so you have a situation where these are one of the largest employers. They are, the Mexican government suffers from very high levels of corruption across the board. And it's very complicated because you might have at the federal level, certain leaders in the federal level support one cartel to another, and then the state separate cartels, and at the local level separate cartels as well. And it's almost at some point when you look at an election, one political candidate might be supported by one cartel, and his political rival is supported by a different cartel. And then through the ballot box or through violence, one cartel and another is trying to gain the upper hand, right? And so that's a huge problem as well. And so I think the underlining issue, though, is it's very hard to have an effective anti-corruption campaign until there's an effective security campaign, right? Because if you're a Mexican official, a lot of times, the Mexican officials are corrupt for an inherent fear because they have no other choice. And other times, who is the actual main driver of corruption and that actually controls a lot of these cartels are those politicians because they have the power. Right. And so when you're analyzing corruption in Mexico, you have to look at it from both lenses. And who's the main driver? Is this a situation where the cartels are corrupting local officials for their own purposes? Or is it the political powers at top that are leveraging the cartels to either maintain their political power and enrich themselves? And they use the cartels as their strongmen to achieve that goal. And you run into both situations. But underlying all that is there's not an effective strategy, a security campaign to maintain security, to have an effective anti-corruption campaign. And I think a lot of American policy towards Mexico, if anything, might worsen the security situation in Mexico. And I'll give it a perfect example. right now, and I had this conversations multiple times, right? Because one of the things people will mention is, well, if you want to weaken the cartels, we need to secure the border, right? And so there's this idea that Mexico needs to commit more forces to secure their border, either their southern border with Guatemala, for example, down in Chiapas, or in the US-Mexican border. And a lot of that is tied more to migration. The belief is, well, if Mexico secures the borders, it will weaken the cartels. Here's the problem. Mexico doesn't have unlimited resources. And so if Mexico makes an agreement with the United States to deploy forces to the border, that means they have less resources available to maintain security in their own internal country and the cities and towns where cartels are operating. And the cartels come in and fill the void. We've seen this happen in Chiapas, right, which has already suffered high levels of violence. The Mexican government announced that they were going to deploy forces because they made an agreement back with the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, that they were going to deploy military personnel and the National Guard down to the border with Guatemala to prevent the caravans from coming. A lot of the forces that were deployed to the border were part of Chiapas, the plan for internal security of Chiapas, because there was always high levels of armed violence in Chiapas. When the forces were deployed to the border to focus on the migrants coming in the caravans from Central America, the cartels filled in. We saw the Sinaloa cartel, specifically Mayo Zambada and Mayito Flaco, take control. We saw CJNG make a huge push into Chiapas. And now, inside of Chiapas, the two main groups responsible for the violence are Mayo Zambada and CJNG through their front, CCYG, Cartel de Chiapas and Guatemala. And so that's a problem. Right. And that's not even talking about, even if we analyze Chiapas, the dozens of groups and armed groups that exist there. Some of them so-called self-defense groups, other local gangs, et cetera, that operate in Chiapas. And you can see that across the board. Like if you go to a border area like Zacatecas, which borders Brownsville, McAllen, Eagle Pass, right? If there's a push to secure the border, the areas that will not receive that much security is further down. So one of the main areas right now in Zacatecas that's seeing increased level of violence, because just like the Sinaloa cartel split and caused a high level of violence, in Zacatecas, one of the main instigator of violence, one of the main reasons why there's intense fighting there, is because there was a split in the Gulf cartel, right? There's the Metros and Grupo Escorpión, the Scorpion group. One of the areas they fight is in San Fernando, Tamaulipas. We see both groups actively fighting there. That's further south, not close to the border. So if you deploy forces to the border, the problem is you're not going to have forces available to maintain security in these more inner cities, in these more deeper inside, these states like San Fernando, that allows these cartels to then come in and either assert their sovereignty and their territorial control in these areas or invites high level of violence. And so in many instances where we actually see that the Mexican government, how they operate, and specifically the Mexican military, ironically, it's almost like they're UN peacekeepers. There's a shot of violence in a specific area. They deploy the Mexican military there that act as the peacekeeping force between rival groups to protect the civilian population. In other instances, we can clearly see the Mexican government takes a side. And we see the Mexican military fight alongside a cartel to fight against a rival. So if you look at Sinaloa and the Sinaloa cartel, specifically in the beginning of the Civil War, the Sinaloa cartel Civil War, it was absolutely abundantly clear that the Mexican military wholeheartedly supported Mayito Flaco. It was an undisputable fact that the Mexican military was supporting Mayito Flaco because they were specifically targeting Chapito leadership, Chapito areas. The Mexican military picked a side. The irony of that situation was that the state and local police in Sinaloa historically supported Los Chapitos. And so then what happened was there was a lot of instances where the Mexican military would then have to go and disarm police officers because of their support for Los Chapitos. And so now you kind of see this very convoluted story. As I mentioned earlier, you might have a situation where at the federal level, they might support one cartel, and at the state level, they might support another. Now, don't get me wrong. We're not going to run into a situation where the Mexican military and the Mexican police are shooting at each other. That's not what's going on. We haven't really seen that. But we do see the Mexican military or police, et cetera, a lot of times fighting alongside a specific cartel. As I mentioned earlier, Zacatecas, that is the Carteles Unidos and CG&G, we have dozens of videos of Zacatecas police fighting side by side Carteles Unidos against CJ&G. And what happened was, the irony of that, is CJ&G used that as a propaganda tool for the local population of Zacatecas, for the people to support CG&G against the Mexican government. Because Carteles Unidos was heavily targeting violently a lot of these farmers, because Carteles Unidos want to control the avocado and lime farming and agriculture. And they were very violent in asserting their control. And the local population went to CG&G for protection, because CG&G let them kind of, the propaganda ploy, CG&G say, we'll let you do your farming, we'll protect you. And so then when Carteles Unidos would come in and take it away from them, and the local population saw that, at least at the federal level, they were being supported at, the state and federal level, Carteles Unidos were being supported by law enforcement and military, the Mexican government lost support of the local population. And so the problem we're running into is, how can you have an effective anti-corruption strategy without an effective security plan? Because Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the previous Mexican president, really ran on that issue of economic development, of eliminating poverty, of trying to get into the underlying conditions of why people are joining the cartels. And it was a very famous phrase that he would say, abrazos no balazos, hugs, not bullets. Tried to demilitarize the war and focus on economic development. It completely failed. And even Andrés Manuel López Obrador transitioned to a security first policy, because he realized that you can do all you want for economic development, but as long as the cartels maintain control of these towns and cities, you're not going to effectively have economic policies to root out the underlying cause of why people join. And so I think that all that huge, large explanation I gave can be summed up in a very simple way. It is very hard to tackle such a strong threat as the Mexican cartels with the resources that the Mexican government have. They don't have an effective judiciary. 90+% of judicial cases for homicide, cartel-related corruption, etc., don't make it even to trial. So their judiciary is wholeheartedly incompetent and incapable of being an effective organization. Their military and police force is completely stretched thin, and they don't have the resources. And so my recommendation would be, there would have to be a serious push across the board, but including the security and military and law enforcement side, to beef up the resources at the Mexican government side, because then they just don't have the resources to really tackle all these problems.
Well, and that's the thing. We've seen the United States send billions of dollars worth of aid in security, as well as counter narcotics. Um, and we have the DEA is operating throughout Central America with these cooperation agreements with the various countries. But I guess one of the things that really stands out to me is this kingpin strategy, where it's, decapitating the head of the snake seems to have further splintered a lot of these organizations. And it seems to me, at least as an observer, that has led to, in some ways, more violence, because they are trying to fill that power vacuum. And it goes just to what you were saying earlier with the Sinaloa cartel and what happened after El Chapo was extradited to the United States. So I'm curious, like, I feel like this needs to be approached on multiple fronts, and I feel like that would, obviously, it's incredibly complex, and it's very easy to say this, but focusing on everything at once instead of just potentially the securitization, because there needs to be something done. Otherwise, they are going to continue to fill their ranks. And one of the things that I think is lost in this conversation, at least in the United States, is there's significant activity on this side of the border. And I know that's been politicized, but I think if we actually look at how that has developed and what that actually means, we'll see that it's not necessarily, stuff that's happening right at the border. It's stuff that's happening North Carolina, Illinois. They're very strategic, or sorry, Illinois. They're very strategic in where they're operating out of, and there's a decent amount of these drugs that are being synthesized or produced on this side of the border. And when we talk about securing the border, uh, most of the drugs that come into the United States, or at least the drugs that are seized at ports of entry. And that gives you an idea of how much must be coming through the ports of entry. Do you think there's a confirmation bias there? And maybe you can speak a little bit to the operations this side of the border in the United
Yeah,
States.
yeah. So I wholeheartedly agree to your first point of the kingpin strategy. So the kingpin strategy, again, the question is, what's your goal? If you're the United States, you want to weaken cartels so they can stop shipping drugs into the United States. Now, clearly, the problem in Mexico is there's a myriad of groups that are operating, right? But the kingpin strategy does weaken cartels, right? That does happen. And to argue against that, I think is incorrect. I mean, the Sinaloa cartel under El Chapo was much more powerful than it is where it is now, where it's basically fractured. But to your point, what we've seen in Mexico, unlike necessarily in Colombia with the kingpin strategy, in Mexico specifically, is what we see is that when a cartel fractures, violence skyrockets, right? And there's multitude of examples that I can go on this podcast for hours and lay out case by case by case. But that's what we see. The kingpin strategy weakens cartels, and ironically, when the cartels are weakened, it's almost violence goes up. And so if you're Mexico, the question is, what's your priority? Is it the weakening of the cartels or to lower violence? Because if you analyze it from that, I think a lot of times when we're talking about this from a US political lens, we focus on the cartel. When you analyze it from the Mexican point of view, they analyze it from an area of stability and lowering violence. And a lot of times those efforts don't necessarily intersect. Now, don't get me wrong. A lot of times you need to challenge these cartels' leadership and hold them accountable for the crimes and weaken them to enable the rise of kind of more of a stable form of local government. But if you're concerned about violence, that might not be the most effective strategy available. And so it's very difficult. And so, look, the Mexican government, are they the ideal counter-narcotic partner of the United States? Do we have excellent, rosy relationships? Of course not. I have talked to a multitude of U.S. sources, law enforcement, intel, that, and some of them at pretty high levels, that are very open a lot of times with their frustrations of sometimes with the coordinations with the Mexican government. But at the same time, even a lot of times the Mexican government are the ones who want to target specific leaders because they realize that these leaders are also one of the main instigators of violence. And so if they want to lower violence, they understand, hey, we need to go after these key figures because they're the main drivers of violence in these communities. And so it's not necessarily analyzing Mexico as one. You kind of have to go by each individual city, state, and even sometimes locality, and kind of make a determination where kind of is the best course of action, depending on what your goal is. And that, again, it just highlights this very convoluted, complicated nature of Mexico, which sometimes a slogan such as hugs not bullets won't solve the problem. But Matthew, to your second point, and your second question, yes, the infrastructure in the United States is extensive. Look, I track cartel members on social media. That's really one of my main areas that I focus on. It doesn't matter the social media. If you have TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, X, doesn't matter. That is what I focus on in tracking you those ways. And I have seen countless cartel members in the United States, openly operating in the United States, from Arizona, Chicago, Cincinnati, New York, you name it. Because the cartels have a very extensive infrastructure in the United States. And then these cartels leverage local gangs to kind of continue their business model. But I think it's also incorrect to just analyze these cartel members as, Mexicans coming across the border. I mean, a lot of these are American citizens. And if you look, for example, at human smuggling, a lot of them are American citizens. A lot of them have no, familiar, cultural, or any ties to Mexico. I mean, the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas is well known to have dealings with Mexican cartels for drug trafficking. The Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, because that's who they get their drugs from, right? And so if you analyze it from human smuggling, a lot of that is done by American citizens that have no connections really with Mexican cartels. And to kind of tie it into the human smuggling aspect, a lot of times in the political discourse, what we're having is it's very quick. They're very quick to blame Mexican cartels, and a lot of the groups that are actually responsible for human smuggling and kind of the migration push and pushing migrants into the United States are not connected to cartels. They're local and sometimes even family criminal networks. Of a significant portion, dozens if not hundreds of these criminal groups are local or family or groups that are not necessarily tied to one specific cartel. Now they might have dealings or agreements, or they pay a plaza fee to operate there, and some of them don't. In Ciudad Juarez, for example, a lot of the violence and the homicides we see in Ciudad Juarez are actually these local human smuggling networks that are not associated in any way, shape, or form to a specific cartel, either the Juarez cartel or the Sinaloa cartel, right? Just battling each other directly and causing homicides to go up in Juarez, not necessarily tied to one or other faction or group or cartel members. And so that's an interesting aspect as well. And so in the U.S., the U.S. has a very effective, law enforcement capability. The U.S. Regularly announce, and conducts operations to capture and detain cartel members operating in the United States. But the infrastructure is there. I mean, you mentioned Chicago. I mean, Chicago is a huge area to ship drugs into the United States. And to your point, yes, the vast majority of it comes from ports of entry. The vast majority of them comes through legal border crossings into the United States, smuggled in. The vast majority of the people detained for smuggling drugs into the United States are American citizens in these ports of entry. I mean, Mexico is our largest trading partner. It's economy of scale. It just makes sense. It makes sense from a business point of view. And so that's been a huge push. I know that the Biden administration really tried to institute better control measures in ports of entry. But if you really want to dent kind of smuggling operations, that's where you're focused. But the problem you're going to run into is there's such high volume of traffic, of just normal economic traffic between Mexico and the United States, that it's impossible. It's impossible to get all the drugs. And so, but again, I want to tie that into an earlier point I made before this question is, you cannot analyze an effective counter cartel strategy simply with a counter drug strategy. I've heavily criticized the term the war on drugs. And people, when they talk about Mexican cartels, they kind of tie it with the war on drugs. That is not a right analogy, because cartel members will traffic anything, and they will traffic legal, normal products like avocados, oil. They will traffic that as well into the United States. We have recent reporting of truckers in Tamaulipas, oil truckers that are being extorted extraordinarily large amount of money by cartel members in Tamaulipas. And all they do is traffic, they do normal legitimate trade on oil. And so again, I think that I think narcotics and migration is a very important aspect when we're analyzing kind of, cartels, but we can't solely be focused on them. You have to take a larger approach at the entirety of the economic infrastructure they use, to include legal means that they operate in.
So, so going back to what you were saying about the truckers, basically what you're saying is they're taxing these truckers. Is that correct?
There was a specific report that they were being taxed. That's correct. But again, I think it's also important. We know cartel members have trafficked oil. Actually, during the previous administration, the Mexican administration of AMLO, one of his main strategies was securing Mexican oil infrastructure and leveraging the military to protect Mexican oil infrastructure, because they lost so much money because of illegal tapping and oil operations that cartel members and even local criminal groups were doing to traffic oil, either inside of Mexico or across the border, and smuggling oil into the United States through these networks. And Andrés Manuel Obrador really tried to effectively try to shut that down. And that's one of the areas where I would say that the previous Mexican administration had some success, not a whole heart, 100%, but they did have some success in kind of reducing the amount of oil that was being smuggled and stolen from the Mexican, state-owned oil industry, Pemex. That they were effective in that, not 100%, but they did do a dent in that. But the specific article I mentioned, yes, that was a taxation policy that cartel members and criminal groups were doing that were causing huge amount of economic pain and damages to the Mexican government and communities and businesses because they were specifically targeting oil transportation and businesses.
So that actually, when talking about taxation, that reminds me a lot of the Salafist groups that you see across the Sahel in Africa, or what you've seen ISIS do. I think a lot of people maybe don't realize how much of their budget and their income comes from, at least over there, it's primarily taxation and extortion. So it makes sense to me that the cartels would be trying to, pretty much get their hand in every pocket that they can. And that sort of brings me to another point.
Can I add something to
Yeah,
that?
of course.
Because one of the things we see recently was it's not only that. I mean, any business extortion on businesses is a huge money making operation for cartels, and we see cartel groups actively target businesses. So a lot of the shootings. So Mexico has had very consistent mass shootings at bars and nightclubs. And the reason why is for twofolds. One, because they generate money for the rival groups, right? And two, they operate also for money laundering. And so recently in Tabasco, a bar was shot up, 6 people were killed, I think 10 were injured just recently. And that appears to be a local group out of Tabasco. It was in Villahermosa called La Barredora. La Barredora gang shot up this bar that looks like was at least superficially, when you look analyzing from outside, might have operated either as a front or had connections with the rivals of La Barredora, which was CJNG. And actually, the leader of CJNG in Tabasco, his name is Comandante 88, the 88 commander, released a video statement saying, hey, we were not responsible for this attack, and put blame on La Barredora. And some of the reporting that I've seen lends belief in that. And we see that also in Guanajuato. When Guanajuato, we see the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel and CG&G, actively target businesses that serve as fronts, either to make money or money laundering, or these businesses are being extorted and taxed by these groups, and they're being targeted. There's a great account on X, formerly known as Twitter, called Wasto, who tied years ago. He did a great report on a lot of the businesses that were being targeted were kind of related to tires, because a lot of these tire businesses were tied and associated with money laundering or acting as fronts for cartel members, and a lot of the shootings and businesses that were being targeted were specifically related to that. So yes, I mean, extortion and local businesses act as fronts. And if you look at the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel specifically, right, they're not a major drug trafficking organization. Yeah, they probably have, they traffic narcotics and drugs, etc. But that's not what they're mainly associated with. What they're mostly associated with is extortion. And the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel in Guanajuato is an extremely violent organization, a very extremely violent cartel. And they have no qualms or problems just doing mass shootings at any businesses to achieve their goals. And if they suspect you of supporting a rival, like their rivals at CJ&G, they'll shoot it up, no problem. It doesn't matter how many people are killed.
Well, and so this is one of the more wonky areas in this discussion, but I kind of want to bring up the idea of terrorism. So traditionally, that is the use of violence to achieve political means. And, we hear this term narco-terrorism. It really does seem to apply here to me. I prefer a much more encompassing use of that term. But at the end of the day, they're trying to gain power, and they do that through intimidation, through various attacks, corruption, whatever means they can to gain power. But one of the things that makes this different than sort of what most people would think of when they think of terrorism is there doesn't really seem to be an ideology. And there's this whole idea of, you've got your bandits, your terrorists, and your freedom fighters. And when you look at a group like, the FARC down in Colombia, like there was an ideology driving their use of the drug trade. If you look at the Salafist groups, or if you look at ISIS, there's this driving ideology behind it. Um, how do you sort of parse that when talking about the violence that these organizations are committing? Do you think it could be defined as terrorism?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there is no doubt about it. No doubt about it. The methods and the tactics they use is wholeheartedly the same that other terrorist organizations use. The objectives might be different, as you said, like the kind of there's not this underpinning ideology for the most part that kind of tells it. I think it's interesting that you said FARC because FARC, yes, they have this kind of this Marxist ideology, but for all intents and purposes, the FARC now is a drug trafficking organization. That's really all they have going for them. The Marxist ideology is kind of a front now. It's really just a criminal organization intended to make money. But if you look at the tactics that cartels use, it's terrorism. I mean, recently this year, we saw car bombings in Guanajuato, as I mentioned earlier, the state I mentioned earlier. There was car bombings in Guanajuato. The Santa Rosa de Lima cartel has actively targeted municipal police because they believe that there are, and a lot of reporting kind of backs that up, that the municipal police in a lot of ways are operating as a front for CG&G. And so the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel targets the municipal police. And even if some of these officers are not tied to CG&G, the local police actively goes after them. And so they have no qualms of targeting them with assassinations. I mentioned mass shootings, attacking bombs. I mentioned car bombings. But I mean, even if you look at the cartels, a lot of the violence that we see can be easily associated with kind of the tactics that ISIS use. I mean, I said decapitations and leaving dismembered body parts is a tactic that cartel uses all the time, and that's almost a daily occurrence in Mexico. I mean, we've seen the videos and the footages of bodies being hanged out of bridges, right? There is a terroristic method, an intent to instill fear in the population. And actually, when cartel members kind of release videos of executions, decapitations that are very similar to what ISIS did in the Middle East, when you look at these videos and the statements that they release with it, the messaging actually, ironically, for the most part, is very localized to that specific region. That even a lot of times I have a hard time trying to understand because they'll release a video, an execution video, and a decapitation video, what you name it, and the statement that they say either before the execution or they make the person that decapitated that they're going to execute release, or the questionnaires they ask them, is a very localized message threatening, let's say, either local rivals or local politicians or local security forces, regardless if they're police at the state or federal level. They will be very localized, and so it's a message for that local population to instill fear, and that's a very common tool that cartels have in their propaganda to instill fear. And I think also more importantly, what the cartels are what they do is the effect they cause is they normalize this violence, so that when it happens, there's not this uproar within the Mexican community to demand action anymore because it's so normalized. Decades ago, a senior Catholic bishop was assassinated in Mexico by the Arellano Felix organization. The Arellano Felix organization tried to assassinate a rival in the Sinaloa cartel. They made a mistake and assassinated a Mexican bishop. That caused an uproar in Mexico, and the Mexican government was forced, because of public pressure, to go after them. And for almost all intents and purposes, really, really did decapitate that group. They still exist. That cartel still exists, but they're nowhere. And the Arellano Felix organization could also be called the Tijuana cartel. They don't exist as they were before because of that assassinating a bishop was back then was unacceptable. Now, the level of violence that we see occurring in Mexico, it's become normalized, enabling these cartels to continue these tactics of terrorizing the local population. Because at the national level, there's not going to be this uproar. And I'll end with this because I do believe it's you can call it narco-terrorism, but there is clearly a terroristic component of it. There's a specific group, the most abhorrent execution videos I've ever seen is from one specific group. They call themselves Operativo Texas, and they're a group under the Cartel del Noreste, the CDN, the Northeast Cartel. CDN is kind of the successor of Zeta. And the Zetas cartel back then were very famous because of this extreme level of violence that got to a point where it was just unacceptable. Unfortunately, the tactics that CDN did that the Zetas cartel did that brought their downfall has been very much normalized across all cartel groups in Mexico.
And the Zetas used to be the security wing of the Gulf Cartel, correct?
Correct. They were former Mexican special forces that then kind of were the security wing of the Gulf Cartel. They broke off, formed their own cartel, started recruiting from the local population, and rarely pride themselves on violence. And that kind of is what brought their downfall. But the problem is that those level of violence that the Zeta cartels did is now the standard operating procedures for almost all cartels across Mexico. So the kind of the successor of the Zetas is the CDN, Cartel de Noreste, the Northeast Cartel, and they're based out of Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas, that borders Laredo, Texas. So a specific group is called Operativo Texas. The most gruesome execution videos I have ever seen is from this group. I mean, to the point where I've seen a substantial amount of ISIS execution videos. I have never seen anything as violent as what this cartel does. Like straight up abhorrent things that I cannot even share verbally on this podcast. I cannot even share it. That it's not even what ISIS in many ways did.
Well, so that's one of the things, and one of the reasons that I brought this up. And, when I was talking about this, bandits versus terrorists versus freedom fighters, there's this old saying, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And I think that the fact that they don't have this ideology drops any pretext that they are freedom fighters. But that doesn't mean that they're
You got to be
okay.
except what I mentioned earlier in Zacatecas.
Well, I'm thinking of the two primary ones that you were speaking to.
No, but even still, right? Because and a lot of times, again, if you have violence between two cartels and one cartel is because again, the cartels how they operate, they have this violent level, right, of extreme violence, but they also have a heart and mind strategy. So, for example, Mother's Day in Mexico, when it's Mother's Day in Mexico, it's normal, regular. Every single cartel will release videos of them handing out gifts for Mother's Day to mothers across Mexico. And they're up armored vehicles with their guns. They'll come up, they'll open their vans, and they'll give gifts. El Día del Niño in Mexico, which is a huge holiday in Mexico. They'll hand out toys to children. The employment aspect we talked about, the distribution of funds, the providing security. So maybe in one area in a specific town, you had various groups fighting each other out and violence was very hard. One cartel comes over and says, this is now our town. Security has been stabilized. The targeting of a corrupt government official might be removed because of cartel. They also have a hearts and mind strategy. So it's both.
So I understand the idea of the hearts and minds strategy, and I think that is important for localized support. But what I'm saying is, because we have this dichotomy, and this is I think it was Collier who first brought this up, but the idea that these conflicts are driven by greed or grievance, and by and large, the cartels are driven by greed. And so from the outsider looking in, it doesn't seem like the actions beyond, and the mafia used to do this, Escobar used to do this, investing back in the communities to get that support. But I don't necessarily think that equates to a freedom fighter who is, fighting oppression.
Correct.
It's
Right.
more
And the
clientelism, if that makes sense.
the only cartel that you maybe, if you want to see an underlying ideological underpinning to it, but I agree, it's the exception, not the norm, would be the Knights Templar that had this very like almost cult like ideology within Christianity. I mean, that's maybe the closest we ever got to kind of this um, ideological underpinning. However, what I would say is that although I agree with you, it's greed. What I would say is cartels are very effective of creating this identity of community and in the propaganda push of loyalty. You cannot discount this loyalty. Like I said, Mayo Zambada had this almost like religious admiration by his followers. And when he was detained and captured, this sense of betrayal, because it was one of the leaders of Los Chapitos, again, a minor figure of the leadership, but still a leader, really drove these groups, became this ideological underpinning against Los Chapitos. And the irony is, Los Chapitos, the kind of the ideological underpinning that they try to leverage is not only for their leadership, like Ivan Archibaldo, one of the sons, but you still see references of El Chapo, the main guy, right? That's now in the United States. You kind of still see that, not as much as before, but do not discount in the propaganda push of the cartels this sense of like this loyalty to the leadership, to the group, and it's even very sometimes it's very hyper localized because in CJNG specifically, a lot of them is kind of to the leaders of the factions within the overarching cartel. So, for example, Jardinero, which is the main faction of CJNG operating in Nayarit and Jalisco, right? A lot of the videos that we see from that specific group that supports the Jardinero, that faction, is directed at the leader of that group. Another one, for example, in Guanajuato, a CGNG front in Guanajuato called, that kind of support the leadership of what's called double R, RR. They also have this sense of loyalty and admiration for the leadership. And so, though I agree with you that it's kind of this greed, not grievance for the most part, the fallacy you run into is that you would think then if we remove the greed, either by providing economic development or other avenues to kind of remove this greed underpinning of support, you run into issues because the loyalty sense of these groups is very, very, very strong and powerful. And it takes a lot more than just that to weaken these cartels.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't think we were going to solve the issue with the cartels on this podcast, but I think the more people understand, I think
Yeah,
the more
exactly,
people
right?
understand, the better equipped we are to make informed decisions. And with it being such a fluid situation, having someone like you on and your knowledge base, I'm very thankful for your time. And I think, we're all a little bit smarter for you joining us here today.
No, and I really appreciated the time to talk. And I would end with 2 points. My first one, to anybody who really wants to understand, or at least get an initial understanding of cartels. There's a specific. I've always referenced this, and somebody I've talked to regularly. There's a specific author called Nathan Jones who wrote a book that really kind of talked about the cartels, and this was published, I believe, in 2016, right? And it talked about in Mexican cartels, there used to be a differentiation in the cartels, right? There used to be the transactional cartels and the territorial cartels. The territorial cartels were more focused on controlling territory, and that kind of led to higher levels of violence. Transactional cartels were more interested in just shipping the product, and then that time mostly drugs. What I think we've seen as a transition is to all these cartels becoming more territorial, hence why we have higher levels of violence. So I highly recommend that, follow Nathan Jones, great author, really helped me understand a lot of the problem sets of the Mexican cartel. But to your, kind of the point we were making earlier about joking about solving the Mexican cartels, you're right. It's a very, very complex problem set that requires a lot of attention and studying. And there's a whole myriad of accounts that I can recommend. Borderland Beat, the Luis Chaparro, Ian Granillo, etc. And again, when we're talking about Mexican cartels, we always talk about what they push to us, and we kind of always neglect to focus on what we give to them. And it's not only the money and the demand, but we also give them a lot of guns. The vast majority of guns that the Mexican cartels use comes from the US. But I'll end with this. I think when we're analyzing it from the globe, what's interesting, not only in Mexico, but the Western Hemisphere in general, what we're seeing in the last 5 to 10 years, is how non-state actors that do not have an ideological underpinning are really causing state decay and almost in many cases collapse, as we're seeing in Haiti. And I think the Western Hemisphere, you can look at any country in Latin America and you can kind of see this, is we're going to start seeing more and more criminal organizations, gangs, cartels, organized crime, challenge state authority. And that's a new thing that we really haven't analyzed in the 20th or 21st century. And there's not that much literature or focus on. And how is it that these gangs, cartels, and organized crimes are really causing state decay and collapse? Because historically, as you said, it's been ideologically driven. That's not the case in the Western Hemisphere. And that's going to, and I truly believe outside of like state actors, I think the next 10, 20, and 30 years, we're going to start seeing more and more and more states running, especially those with less economic development, really be challenged much more by greed, by groups focused on greed. And until we put a lot of emphasis and study on that, I think we're in for a world of hurt and we're going to be caught by surprise. And with that, I really thank you all for having me as a speaker, and I hope to speak soon in the near future.
Thank you so much, All Source. I think that is an excellent topic for uh, our next conversation. We can talk about the implications of the globalization of the drug market and what this means for the United States and for the security across the globe. So thank you so much for the conversation. I'm sure we will have another one. And this has been the bottom line up front. Christian, do you have anything left?
No, I really appreciate you coming on. It was an excellent discussion.